I never imagined my life would be pulled into a storm because of a cruel bet made in a room I was never meant to enter. My name is Maria. I was 24 then, working as a maid in Arthur Montero's mansion, trying to survive after losing my parents far too young and being left with debts that felt like an ocean swallowing me whole. I lived humbly, quietly, always keeping my head down. To men like Arthur, I wasn't supposed to exist as anything more than a shadow cleaning their glasses, their floors, their sins. That night, the Montero mansion was ablaze with lights, a party that filled every corner with champagne laughter and hollow music. I was carrying trays of drinks, moving like an invisible servant through rooms where diamonds sparkled on gowns and arrogance hung thicker than perfume. I heard my name once the maid, but never Maria. I thought it would be just another evening of avoiding stares and counting the hours until I could sleep. I didn't know my life was about to be auctioned off in a game between men. Arthur stood in the center of it all, the perfect picture of a millionaire who believed the world bent to his will. His confidence was a weapon, and every smirk of his made people lean in closer. Then came Thomas, his so-called friend, whose tongue was sharper than any blade. I wasn't close enough to hear everything, but I caught the rise of laughter, the mocking tone, the sudden silence of anticipation. And then their eyes, Thomas's gaze sliding toward me, Arthur's narrowing in recognition. "Your maid," Thomas said, and though I couldn't hear the rest, I felt the weight of it as though invisible strings had tied me to their game. When I dared to glance their way, Arthur's lips curled into a cold smile. That smile would change my life forever. The next morning he came to the kitchen where I was scrubbing dishes. I froze when I saw him there. Men like him didn't wander into places like that. His words fell like stones in the silence. "Maria, I want you to marry me." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd, terrifying. A maid being asked to marry her employer, but he wasn't joking. He placed a check on the counter, the sum written on it large enough to erase every bill that haunted my nights. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and temptation. "Why me?" I whispered, and he didn't even flinch. "Because you're perfect for it. No one would expect me to marry someone like you." Those words cut deeper than any insult. I wasn't a woman in his eyes. I was a role in a wager, a pawn to prove his pride. Every instinct told me to refuse. But then I thought of my siblings, the debts, the endless hunger of survival. My hands trembled when I said yes, knowing I had just signed away a piece of myself. The day we went to the registry office, I walked beside him like a ghost. The papers were signed quickly, his lawyers smiling as though this were a normal transaction. But for me, each stroke of the pen felt like a chain tightening around my neck. When we returned to the mansion, the staff stared with wide eyes, whispering behind curtains. I was no longer the maid. I was Mrs. Montero. Yet nothing about me felt changed except the burden in my chest. He led me upstairs to a room that looked like something out of another universe. Velvet curtains, a bed larger than the space I'd grown up in, closets filled with clothes worth more than my entire life. "This will be your room," he said, as though declaring ownership of the air I breathed. My heart whispered, "You don't belong here." The days that followed blurred into lessons in appearances. Clara, his stylist, arrived with racks of gowns and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She dressed me, measured me, polished me, until I barely recognized the girl in the mirror. I wasn't Maria anymore. I was his project, his experiment. Yet beneath the silk and diamonds, I still felt like the maid carrying trays through a room that never wanted me. Our first dinner together as husband and wife was a circus. Arthur's friends sat across from us, their laughter thin and cruel, testing me like predators circling prey. One of them leaned forward, smirking. "So this is Mrs. Montero?" My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to smile, to answer with a calm I didn't feel. To their surprise, I pushed back, not with arrogance, but with honesty. Their laughter faltered. Arthur's eyes lingered on me with something unreadable, something that unsettled me more than their mockery. That night alone in the vast cold room, I whispered to myself, 3 months. Just 3 months. But deep inside, I knew something irreversible had already begun. I counted the days, at first scratching them quietly into the back of a notebook I hid under my pillow. 3 months. 90 days. That was the length of my sentence, the time I thought I could endure before this bizarre arrangement collapsed under its own cruelty. I told myself that if I stayed quiet, if I played the part of the dutiful wife, I would walk away with enough money to secure a future for my siblings and finally breathe without the chokehold of debt. But life has a way of unraveling even the most carefully rehearsed lies. Arthur didn't treat me like a wife, not really. To him, I was both invisible and glaringly present. An accessory paraded at his dinners, a name he could throw around to shock his acquaintances. He never touched me, not with tenderness, not even with desire. Instead, he studied me like I was a riddle he hadn't meant to solve, but couldn't resist returning to. I remember one particular evening. He hosted another dinner this time with investors whose eyes were sharper than blades. I was dressed in a gown that felt like borrowed skin, my hair pulled tight, my smile fixed. One of the men, older with a cruel twist to his lips, leaned toward Arthur and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "A maid in silk is still a maid." The laughter that followed was suffocating. My stomach knotted. My palms trembled under the tablecloth. I expected Arthur to laugh with them, to dismiss me as the joke I was supposed to be, but instead he looked at the man, his jaw tight, and said with ice in his voice, "Careful. You're in my house." The room went silent. Shocked glances darted between us, and though the humiliation still burned in my chest, something else flickered there too. Confusion. Why would he defend me? He didn't need to. I was just part of a bet, wasn't I? Later that night, when we were alone, I asked him why. He didn't answer right away. He just poured himself a drink, his hand lingering on the glass. Finally, he muttered, "Because you don't deserve that." Those words lodged in my heart like an ache I couldn't name. They weren't kind, not exactly, but they were human. And they reminded me that under all his arrogance, there was a man carrying something heavy too, something he wasn't ready to show. As days stretched into weeks, the mansion became less of a prison and more of a battlefield. I challenged him sometimes with words, sometimes with silence. He tried to maintain control, but I could see the cracks, moments when his eyes softened, as I laughed with the staff, moments when his gaze lingered too long as I walked away. And then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered against the windows. The lights flickered, and for once the house felt alive with chaos. I had gone to the library to escape the suffocating silence of my room. I found him there, sitting alone in the dark, a single lamp casting shadows across his face. He didn't look like a millionaire then. He looked broken. Without thinking, I asked, "Why did you do it? Why marry me?" He looked at me, and for the first time there was no smirk, no armor. "Just truth. Because I was dared," he said softly. "Because I thought it would prove I could bend anyone to my will. But the joke's on me, Maria. You're not bending. You're breaking me instead." My chest tightened. I should have hated him for admitting it, for confirming that my life had been turned upside down by nothing more than a cruel bet. But the pain in his voice disarmed me. He wasn't proud of it. He was ashamed. Still, shame didn't erase the wound. That night, as thunder rolled across the sky, I lay awake, torn between rage and something dangerously close to pity. And in that fragile space between, a new fear took root. What if my heart betrayed me before the 90 days were over? I thought the worst was already behind me. I didn't know the real secret, the one waiting to be uncovered on our wedding night, would shatter everything I believed about him, about myself, and about the fragile line between revenge and love. The wedding crept up on me like a dare I couldn't refuse. There was no church, no priest, no family, just a small civil ceremony staged for photographs that would travel through Arthur's world faster than truth ever could. I wore a dress that didn't feel like skin, and stood beside a man who smelled of cedar and distance. He slid a ring onto my finger as if he were fitting a key into a lock. Applause flared, cameras blinked, and I smiled the way people smile when their throat is closing. Somewhere a violinist played a song that had been happy in another life and was now a knife with strings. The reception did what receptions do. It turned people into characters who mistook their hunger for insight. Women inspected me with curiosity polished into cruelty. Men offered congratulations that sounded like wagers. Thomas gave a toast that tasted like poison cut with champagne. To the groom's improbable courage, he said, raising his glass, and laughter rippled, as if we'd all agreed not to look too closely at the word improbable. I felt my stomach roll. I caught Arthur watching me across the glittering air, his expression unreadable, the gold of the room caught in the gray of his eyes. When the last car rolled down the drive and the mansion sank into the tired silence that follows spectacle, the housekeeper in me counted the glasses left behind, the smears of lipstick on napkins, the footprints of rich men who never look back. It should have been our wedding night. The phrase alone made my skin tremble. In another life, I would have been a bride who undressed a future with hope. In this one, I stood in a room cut from velvet and doubt. I told myself I was ready, ready to accept whatever this sham required, ready to add one more bruise I wouldn't talk about. He didn't come to the room. Minutes bled into an hour. The storm that had been threatening since dusk finally broke wind, worrying the old oaks until their branches clicked at the glass like impatient fingers. I waited until the dread turned into anger, until the ring on my finger felt like a door knocker pounding against my bones. Then I left. Barefoot, I walked the corridor I had cleaned 100 times, past portraits of men whose eyes never learned to be kind, down the stairs that remembered my lighter footsteps when I belonged to the morning shift and not to him. A light burned under the office door. I pushed it open and found him there, not in a tuxedo anymore but in shirt sleeves, his tie unknotting like a confession. Papers covered the desk, the rug, the leather chairs. Boxes yawned open like wounds. The safe stood ajar. I had never seen Arthur look small, but he did now, like a man who had been handed a mirror, heavy enough to break his arms. He didn't startle when he saw me. He only lifted a single page and held it out. His voice was the scrape of a match. Read. I took the paper because he asked me to, because I no longer trusted my legs. It was a memo decades old. The company letterhead faded to a tired blue. Names I knew by rumor and billboards. Words I had learned to hate acquire liquidate leverage. And at the heart of it, like a nail hammered through skin, my last name. A plan drafted by his father and signed by men who treated small businesses like chess pieces. They had mapped the collapse of my parents' shop as if mapping a golf course foreclosed the loan smear, the reputation by the property, for less than it's worth, bury the noise with charitable donations. There, in a neat column, sat Community Relief Disbursement M. Alvarez. The relief had a number, a date, a purpose to keep us quiet while we starved with receipts. The room tilted. I remembered my mother's hands cracking from detergent, my father's voice going quiet in the weeks before he died, the way our front door had sounded when men in suits came to measure the windows for someone else's future. I looked up, and Arthur was already watching the ruin bloom in my face. There are more, he said low. Files your parents were never meant to see. Letters from your mother to mine. Checks my father sent to purchase shame. He swallowed. And this? He handed me a photograph. My breath snagged. My parents stood in front of their shop, younger than any memory I owned, hope still hot in their smiles. On the back, in a hand I didn't recognize, forgive me, E.M. The initials stung. Elena Montero, his mother, the woman with the museum hair and the portraits lining the hall, the woman whose pearls had paid to keep a ghost in our house. I felt my mouth shape the words before I heard them. You knew. Not like this, he said, and if there was a lie in him, it was too tired to stand. I heard rumors. I ignored them. I thought my father's sins were museums, things you take wealthy guests to look at and then leave behind. Tonight, he gestured to the storm of paper. I opened the safe to retrieve the deed for a property Thomas insisted we sell. His voice broke on the name. The bet I thought I could play their game and win at being harmless. The safe had this in it. It's been here in my house while you scrubbed these floors. The office with its heavy curtains and heavier history crowded in. My first impulse was simple and holy: to burn it all. To strike a match and watch the lies curl black. But candles don't keep a storm from coming back. They only make the dark look farther away. He leaned back against the desk like a man who had been pushed into a confession he deserved. I don't want to touch you, he said so soft I had to step closer to hear, not because you are unworthy, but because I am. I married you to entertain wolves. But they weren't hungry for you. They were hungry for me to prove I'm my father's son. Tonight, I opened that safe to feed them and found a ledger of ghosts. His eyes met mine without armor. Tell me what to do, and I will do it. I closed my hand around the photo until the edges bit. I had spent weeks building a body hard enough to outlive humiliation, and here was a moment tender enough to drown in. I could walk out, take the money, promise become a woman who survived on silence. Or I could ask the son of my enemy to help me bury a dynasty with its own stones. My voice surprised me by not shaking. You won't do it for me, I said. You'll do it because it's right. You'll hand me copies of everything. You'll call your lawyer the one who still prays when no one watches. You'll invite Thomas here tomorrow and wait. When he comes, you'll let him talk and then you'll let him see what we see. He nodded as if each instruction locked a joint into place. Outside, thunder rolled like furniture dragged across the sky. He reached for the ring on my finger and stopped himself, the gesture hovering ashamed. I can't fix the bet, he said, but I can end the game. Start with the safe, I said. We empty it together. We worked until the storm lost interest, until dawn diluted the windows. We stacked evidence like bricks of stolen light, contracts, memos, receipts, apologies that arrived too late to be called that. At one point, exhaustion made him sway, and I caught his sleeve without thinking. He looked at me the way people look at clean water after too long in the dust. It should have been our wedding night. Perhaps it was in a sense no camera could adore a ceremony of unburials, a consummation of the only vows that mattered: truth over blood, courage over legacy. I didn't forgive him. Forgiveness is a language you speak only when your tongue has learned new letters. But I believed him as much as I believed the storm outside our window. And belief that night was a rope we could both hold without strangling. When we finally closed the safe on its own emptiness, the sun was a rumor in the east. He exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath since childhood. When Thomas arrives, he said he will bring a pack. Then we'll be the fire, I answered. Thomas arrived with the smirk of a man who thought the world had already agreed to kneel. Behind him came two more investors, both carrying the scent of cigars and entitlement, their eyes scanning the Montero estate as though measuring its worth. I stood at the top of the staircase, my hands clenched around the photograph of my parents, my breath shallow but steady. Arthur had told me to stay out of sight, but I refused. If this house was to become a battlefield, I would not fight from the shadows. We gathered in the library, the same place where the safe still stood, now emptied of its ghosts and lined with evidence piled high on the desk. Thomas leaned against a chair, his voice dripping venom. So, Arthur, rumor has it you've tied yourself to a maid. Is that what desperation looks like? His laughter filled the air, but no one joined him. Arthur didn't rise to the bait. His face was stone, his posture calm in a way I had never seen before. I didn't invite you here to discuss my wife, he said evenly. I invited you to discuss my father's sins. The room shifted. One of the investors stiffened, the other frowned. Thomas's grin faltered, but only slightly. Careful with your words. The Montero legacy isn't something you throw on a table like poker chips. Arthur's eyes flicked toward me, then back to them. You're right. It's not poker. It's a ledger. And the debt is long overdue. He opened a folder and slid it across the table. Contracts, letters, forged receipts, all the evidence of how his father had ruined families like mine. The investors leaned in their expressions, turning from boredom to unease. Thomas, however, laughed louder, a desperate edge cutting through his confidence. So what, Arthur? You expose your father, you destroy yourself. You'll lose everything. Is that really what you want? Before Arthur could answer, I stepped forward. My voice trembled at first, but then it grew steady. It's not about what he wants, it's about what is right. Families were torn apart by those papers. Mine was one of them. I buried my father because of your empire's greed. I cleaned these floors while your glasses overflowed with wine. You thought we were too small to matter, but tonight you're wrong. The silence was thick. Thomas's gaze snapped to me, his eyes narrowing. You, he hissed. The maid. This is your doing. Arthur's voice was sharp as a blade. "No, this is our doing." Thomas's mask cracked then. Rage flickered in his eyes, but beneath it was something uglier fear. He glanced at the investors, but their faces had already hardened. They weren't loyal to Arthur's father's memory. They were loyal to their own survival. And survival demanded distance from scandal. The meeting ended with slamming doors and threats muttered under breath, but the damage was done. The investors abandoned Thomas. The press fed carefully. By Claire, the journalist began circling like hawks. And the Montero name, once polished like marble, began to fracture under the weight of its own lies. That night, as the house emptied of wolves, I stood by the window, my hands pressed against the cold glass. "It's only beginning," I whispered. Arthur joined me, his reflection pale beside mine. "I know," he said. His voice was weary but certain. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But I'll stand in this fire until it burns away every lie my father built." I turned to him then, seeing not the man who had once smirked through a cruel bet, but the man stripped raw by truth. For the first time I wondered if redemption could grow in the ruins of betrayal. Still, pain clung to me like a second skin. The wounds of my family's past didn't vanish with one confrontation. They throbbed with every memory, every bill, every tear shed over an empty table. But I also knew this silence would never bury us again. And so, with Arthur at my side, not as my savior, not yet as my love, but as a man willing to face the ghosts he inherited, we prepared for the storm still coming. The storm did come fiercer than either of us imagined. Newspapers plastered headlines about corruption, betrayal, and the downfall of the Montero dynasty. Every morning when I walked past the newsstands, I saw Arthur's name dragged through ink and mud, his face printed beside words like fraud, legacy of lies, betrayal of trust. And though a part of me felt vindicated justice clawing its way into daylight, another part couldn't ignore the weight pressing on his shoulders. He bore every accusation, every whisper without flinching. It was almost as if he welcomed the punishment. At night, the mansion no longer echoed with the laughter of investors and socialites. It stood hollow, haunted by the emptiness of a family name crumbling under truth. I often found Arthur alone in the library, the same room where the safe once kept its secrets. Sometimes he drank, sometimes he stared at the fire as though trying to burn away the ghosts. But more often he worked. Stacks of documents, ledgers, and testimonies filled the desk, each one a piece of the puzzle we were putting together to dismantle the empire his father had built on lies. I tried to keep my distance, reminding myself that I was here because of a cruel bet, not love. But the line between justice and something more blurred with each passing day. One evening I found him asleep at the desk, his head resting on folded arms, exhaustion etched into every feature. I covered him with a blanket, my hand lingering for a moment longer than it should have. He stirred, eyes half opening, and whispered, "Maria." The way he said my name, it wasn't the arrogant drawl of a man amused by his game. It was soft, fragile, almost reverent. I fled the room before my heart could betray me. Weeks later, the trial began. I walked into the courthouse carrying my mother's photograph in my bag, her eyes reminding me of why I was there. The courtroom was filled with reporters, victims, and vultures waiting for blood. Arthur sat at the defendant's table, no longer dressed like a king, but like a man stripped bare. Suit simple, tie askew, shoulders heavy. When the judge called his name, he stood and confessed to everything he had uncovered, his voice steady, even as the gallery gasped. He did not defend himself, nor did he shield his father's memory. He laid it all out, every detail, every crime, even when it painted him as complicit by silence. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled. I told them about my father's despair, my mother's letters, the debts that drowned us. I told them how I had been dragged into this sham of a marriage by arrogance, but how that very act had forced open the safe where truth was buried. And then I looked at Arthur. "He is guilty," I said, my voice breaking, "but he is also the only reason we finally have proof. Without him, the truth would have stayed in the dark." The judge listened, his expression unreadable. Verdicts take time, but that day something shifted. The victims who once glared at Arthur began to see him not just as a son of betrayal, but as a man who chose to expose his own bloodline's sins. When the trial recessed, reporters swarmed us outside. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed toward me, questions spilling like bullets. "Do you still love him?" one shouted, and I froze. Love. The word felt dangerous, fragile too soon. I didn't answer, only walked past them with my head high. That night, back in the mansion, Arthur found me by the staircase. His eyes were hollow but determined. "You don't owe me forgiveness," he said, "but you deserve the truth of me. I didn't just marry you for a bet. I stayed married to you because I couldn't let you go, not after you showed me who I could be without the lies." His confession struck me harder than any headline. My heart wavered, torn between the scars of betrayal and the fragile bloom of something real. And as I stood there staring at the man who had once been my enemy, my jailer, my accidental ally, I knew the final choice would soon be mine: to walk away with justice, or to stay and risk learning if love could grow in the ashes of revenge. The final day of the trial felt like a funeral for an empire. The courtroom was suffocating heavy with the breath of hundreds waiting to witness the end of a dynasty. Victims filled the benches, their faces lined with years of suffering, some clutching faded photographs of loved ones lost to despair and ruin. Reporters scribbled every word, every movement, hungry to capture the downfall of a family that once seemed untouchable. I sat at the witness bench again, my mother's picture hidden in my purse, her smile steadying me as though whispering, "This is for us." Across the room, Arthur stood, shoulders squared, though the weight of generations bore down on him. He looked smaller without his arrogance, but somehow stronger. When the judge asked if he had any final words, he rose slowly, his voice steady, though I caught the tremor beneath. "My father built this empire on ashes," he began, "on the ruins of small families, of businesses destroyed, so he could claim more than his share. For years I turned away, pretended I didn't see the pain left in his wake. But silence is complicity, and I will not carry his lies any longer. Today, I renounce every stone in this house of betrayal. Let justice fall where it must, even if it falls on me." A murmur swept through the room, but Arthur didn't flinch. He looked at the victims, not at the cameras. His words cut through the air like a confession carved into stone. For the first time, I saw the man he could have been all along, someone willing to bleed for the truth. When the judge delivered the ruling, it came with thunderous weight. The Montero estate was to be dismantled, assets seized, restitution paid to victims where possible. The name that once demanded respect was reduced to rubble in the span of a single sentence. Arthur himself would face years of monitoring, financial restrictions, and exile from the empire he was born to inherit. Outside, chaos erupted. Cameras flashed, people shouted, some jeered, others cheered. I stepped out into the swarm, and before I could escape, Arthur caught my arm gently. His voice was hoarse, almost pleading. "Maria, whatever happens next, I need you to know I never wanted to hurt you. If you walk away now, I won't stop you. But if you stay—" His words faltered, his eyes raw, stripped of all the armor he once wore. "If you stay, maybe we can build something honest, something ours." My chest ached. I thought of my father's grave, my mother's letters, the long nights of hunger and humiliation. I thought of the cruel bet that had trapped me here, the arrogance that had once burned in his smile. But I also thought of the safe we emptied together, the wolves we faced side by side, the way his voice had broken when he admitted he was unworthy of touching me. I didn't answer him then. Some wounds need more than words, but I didn't pull my hand away either. In the weeks that followed, the mansion emptied. The chandeliers went dark. The paintings were taken down, the walls that once echoed with false laughter stood quiet. I packed my things slowly, unsure whether I was leaving forever or only long enough to find myself again. Arthur stayed in the library most days, meeting with lawyers, signing away what little remained. He didn't try to stop me when I moved toward the door one morning, suitcase in hand. He only whispered, "Be free, Maria. And if freedom ever brings you back to me, I'll be here not as a Montero, but as a man." I walked out into the sunlight, the world feeling vast and terrifying, but mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Months passed. Justice was slow, messy, imperfect, but it came. Families received restitution, victims found their voices again. My siblings and I rebuilt piece by piece, not with diamonds or mansions, but with honesty, with hard work, with nights where laughter felt possible again. And yet, sometimes in the quiet moments, I found myself thinking of Arthur. Not the man of the bet, not the heir of corruption, but the man who chose to burn his own legacy for the truth. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I realized something. Revenge had given me justice, but forgiveness, careful, cautious on my own terms, was the only thing that could give me peace. If my story has touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment if you've ever carried the weight of betrayal and found a way to heal. I would love to hear your voice.